All right, so we did some review of some stuff that's relevant. The multiple regression and review a little bit of logistic regression and exploratory factor analysis. And now we're going to move on into talking about latent variable stuff more generally, and move away from stuff that we've seen before. So let's do it. So we've talked about I covered this a little bit in that first ghost chasing lecture, but there's a lot of terms, a lot of jargon. I figured it's worth sort of hitting them again just to make sure that they're sticking. So latent variable models are, to me, is a more sort of umbrella term that refers to any kind of model that has a latent variable in it. There are lots of different ways of getting at latent variables. Structure equation modeling, covariance structure analysis, these kinds of things are one way in which to get at latent variables, but so is atom response theory that we'll talk about much later. There are these causal models and path analysis sort of terms that technically do not have any latent variables in it, but because they use the same kind of thing like SEM to solve for them, people oftentimes will use them interchangeably. Causal models is probably my least favorite term because more often than not, there actually isn't any cause to the models. So the fact that cause is put in there makes it actually sort of misleading. They're not causal in an experimental design sort of fashion. Like path models, they're sort of diagrams of how variables influence one another. So they inappropriately use the term cause there, but simultaneous equations is another way of sort of people have referred to this because you're literally solving for multiple equations at the same time. And then, of course, confirmatory factor analysis gets used interchangeably a lot with this too, because the way we often will go and look at confirmatory factor analysis is through like an SEM model, even though that's changing. And there are other types of confirmatory factor analysis types of things that we'll get to later on. So what is SEM? What are latent variable models? A true structural equation model, like that term to be used appropriately, a structural equation model, it requires two different things, two different components. And it's basically a combination of factor analysis and regression. Where factor analysis allows us to relate measured items to the factors, right? It allows us to say that I think these items are being driven by this latent variable, this factor. Exploratory factor analysis doesn't allow us to take one factor and predict it with another. So if you take this a step further and you actually add in some regression in there, so you're able to actually predict one latent variable from another, you're actually getting into a full structural equation model or full structural regression analysis, which we'll get to shortly. So you can have continuous and discrete predictors and outcomes and relationships among measured or latent variables, any combination of those. There's a direct link between the path diagrams and the equations and the fit statistics, everything's sort of related together. So when we talk about simultaneous equations, those equations are typically the paths in the models actually relate directly to equations that get solved in the analysis on all the parameters that we're trying to estimate. And again, a true structural equation model contains both measurement and path models combined together. All right, so questions so far while I'm collecting myself back together, trying not to freak out about the answer everywhere. So when we talk about some of the jargon in this is probably things you gotta get used to. First, we talk about sort of measurement and structure, and there's all these different terms. So when we talk about measured, all right, so the whole point of doing a latent variable model is to try to identify latent variables. But to do that, we have to use measured variables to get there. So when we talk about measured variables, these are things that can be directly measured. So these are the observed variables, the indicators. They're oftentimes referred to as manifest variables because of the terms are complementary, latent and manifest. For those clinical folks, what is latent and manifest mean in clinical terms? Yeah, so latent often is just a fancy term for sort of hidden. Right, the one that people use all the time is sort of latent homosexuality. People that have homosexual traits, but they try to hide them. They try to push them down. So they have latent homosexuality, where the behaviors they have that indicate that they have latent homosexuality are the manifest things, the things that latent homosexuality is manifesting in them. So latent oftentimes refers to sort of hidden, and manifest refers to the things that are actually visible that represent those latent traits, latent variables. Those terms get used. Latent gets used a lot more often. Manifest not so much, but these basically the manifest variables are the things that we're trying to measure. They're the predictors, they're the outcomes in a path analysis. If you have just a path analysis, then it's all just measured variables. Right? So these are typically the squares in any diagram you see for latent variable models. Latent variables are then the unobservable, the hidden things that we're trying to measure. These are these constructs that are not directly measurable that we're using factor analysis to try to capture in the first place. It's what we're theorizing is the construct that is driving the measured variables in the first place, right? So if you're looking at a depression factor, we're hypothesizing that depression, this thing that we believe exists but can't measure directly, is driving people's responses to all the items on a depression inventory. These are typically represented by circles in the diagram. So whenever you see a diagram of a structure equation model, path model, the circles are the latent variables, the squares are measured, which means that any square on a diagram means that the person directly responded to something there. Right? It was directly measured from them. So it was a question on a questionnaire. It's a cognitive measure. It's a neurobehavioral measure. It's something that they were directly measured on in terms of their whatever it is you're trying to capture with the latent variable. So we talked a little bit about this last time, where you have E's are in any model are referencing sort of variance left over after prediction of a measured variable. But that gets a little tricky because that means that E's are a little bit flexible. So we label them E's. So anytime you have a measured variable of any sort, so if I have any square and there's an arrow coming to that square, there's going to be an additional arrow that has an E attached to it. Okay, that's the arrow left over. The problem is, not the problem, but what makes it a little bit confusing is if this is coming from another measured variable, then this is just a typical error. It's an error in prediction, right? So it's our error variance, just like it is in a regression. That's problem. So this is completely true. It's also true if we look at this, if it's a latent variable that is predicting it, that this sort of makes sense. It is the variance left over after prediction of a measured variable. But if this latent variable is predicting this, then this is not necessarily a regression. This is now a loading, which makes this not a regular error, but this is now the sort of unique variance in a factor analysis. But this E represents both. It's the variance left over. If it's prediction, like in a regression equation, then it is error. If it's from a factor like this, then this E represents unique variance. So what we label as E sort of plays a couple different roles, and you will see later on the reason why that is because it really doesn't matter. Mathematically, when it starts to figure all this stuff out, it solves for this the same way. So it doesn't matter if it's unique or error, whatever it is, it's being solved, being estimated the same way. If the same thing happens where you have a factor that's being predicted by something. Doesn't matter what it is, say it's another factor. Right? It's the same thing. It's just we call it a D instead of an E. It's D for disturbance instead of an E for error. And that's just to separate out that this is the error left over when a measured variable is predicted, and this is the error left over after a latent variable is predicted. These terms are fun. I like these ones. These ones can oftentimes get a little bit confusing. You have exogenous and endogenous. So I remember probably from like chemistry maybe or physics. What does exogenous and endogenous mean in general? Sort of. So, I mean, so you said inside or outside. All right, well, that's true. But think about it, instead of just being inside or outside, which way is something moving? So if something is exogenous, it's moving towards. Yeah, it's moving from in to out, right? So the direction is going out of it. So if I have a variable that has an arrow going away from it, then this variable then is exogenous. The influence is going from this variable away from it. Now, if I have another variable where the influence is coming to it, then it makes that an endogenous variable. The movement is coming inside as opposed to going outside. Make sense? You're probably thinking like exoskeleton and endoskeleton, right? Probably maybe the terms you're thinking of, which is actually right, because an exoskeleton is on the outside, endoskeleton is on the inside. But it's about sort of which way is it moving. If the prediction is moving away from it, like to the outside, then it's exogenous. If it's moving to it, it's endogenous. The only time that it's actually may seem complicated, even though it really isn't, is once a variable becomes endogenous, it remains endogenous. So even though this variable has both an arrow coming to it and away from it, it's considered endogenous, not exogenous anymore. So an exogenous variable, it can only be exogenous, or an endogenous variable can technically be both. The reason why that is because these terms actually sort of go together. This is sort of like, this is now going to be the same thing as sort of independent variable, where this will be the same thing as sort of dependent variable. So if something is independent, right, it influences other things, right? So to be independent, it has the influence on something else, and it's not influenced by anything else. That's why it's independent. So once a variable becomes dependent, endogenous, even if it influences something else, we can't say this is also independent because it's dependent on this one. So once a variable becomes dependent, even if it predicts other things, it cannot go back to being independent again. So exogenous means the arrows are moving away from the variable. Endogenous means the prediction, the influence is coming to the variable. And once a variable becomes endogenous, it remains that way and cannot also be exogenous at the same time. So even if variance then also turns out, so the question is just trying to clarify exogenous and endogenous. If a variable, so if you think about a lot of different variables, right? You have a bunch of them. If an arrow is moving away from it, and away from it only, right? That makes it exogenous. Right? So these two are I'll just say this. These are exogenous. These are all endogenous, right? But as soon as you add something like this to it, this is no longer exogenous, it's endogenous. Right? So even though it is turning around and influencing other things, there is some exogenous variance or prediction going on. As soon as it becomes dependent on this one, it's no longer exogenous alone. It is considered endogenous. This is basically, even though this is technically, it's both working as a DV and an IV. Once it becomes a DV, it can't be considered an IV anymore. Once it's dependent, it can no longer be considered independent. Now, the other tricky part of this is, with that rule in mind, one thing to keep in mind is that we're going to have errors here, right? We're going to have an E there, have an E there. And we're going to have one here. It also tells you something about the errors. Errors are also considered exogenous. They're also sort of independent predictors of this. Just a weird way to think about it. But these are also considered sort of the independent variables in the model because they're exogenous, predicting these variables. The arrows are going away from it to the variables that we're predicting. All right. And it doesn't go, this rule about which direction things are going only works when it comes to one-headed arrows or whatever. If I go back to this scenario where this is exogenous again, exogenous variable. Okay, so no E anymore. If I decide to, say, correlate these, that doesn't impact the fact that they're both still exogenous. They can be correlated. It's just one side decide on a directional prediction from like one to the other that changes whether one is exogenous or endogenous. All right, so we also talk about sort of measurement. I mentioned this already, but let's sort of clarify. You got measurement models and path models. So a measurement model is the part of the model that relates indicators to latent factors. So the measurement part is how we actually create the latent variables, and it's all about the loadings and the influence from the latent variable to the items. The measurement model is the factor analytic part of an SAM model, right? So it's the factor analytic part. It's the confirmatory factor analysis portion of it. Where the path model is the regression model. So whenever you hear the term path model, think about regression. This is what it has. The slopes in it, it's relating variables together, it's about prediction. If no factors are in the model, then only path model exists between indicators, right? So anytime you have no factors, it's only a path model. If you have no path model, there's no prediction, and you only have measurement, right? That's called a confirmatory factor analysis. It's because there's no prediction anymore. You have things like direct effects, indirect effects, which we've talked about before in various ways, right? So direct effects, regression coefficients of direct prediction means that an error goes from one variable to another directly. If you can go from one variable to another variable through other variables by following the sort of arrows along, then you get indirect effects. These are sort of the mediating effects of x1 on y through x2, etc. All right, so and if we combine them both together, direct and indirect together, what's that called? No, so it's not moderation. Moderation and mediation get confused a little bit. It's oftentimes because you can reconfigure your mediation hypothesis into moderation and sort of vice versa. But remember when we talked about you have x predicting y by itself, that's called C. And then we said, all right, we have x, let's make this x1. x1 to x2 to y. This is now C prime. This is now the direct effect. And if you go through these, it's called the indirect effect, going this way, It's the indirect effect. So what is it up here? If I don't have the mediator in the model, x1 to y, this path represents what? It's actually it's these two paths combined together. We like just reviewed this stuff. Direct plus indirect equals, that's the total effect. So the total effect of x1 on y is here. And we're taking that total effect and splitting it up into the direct and indirect effects. Confirmatory factor analysis, like I said a minute ago, this is for confirmatory factor analysis, this is basically if there's no path, that's called no structure. Okay. It's all measurement, no structure. You have covariance structure. So this is what we're going to start with, which is covariance structure, which at first is going to seem a little bit odd, but you'll get used to it pretty quick because it's the relationships based on variance and covariances only, which means that even though I talk about path analysis and multiple regression being essentially the same, the big difference is multiple regression gives you slopes and an intercept. When you do covariance structure, it's not going to estimate an intercept. It's just going to give you the slopes without an intercept because there's no way of getting the intercept or the level of a variable when looking only at variance and covariance. We actually have to add in something called a mean structure in order to do that, which is the other part of this, which now includes the means of stuff into the model. And we can then model both the intercepts and the slopes and look at things like group differences on, group mean differences on variables across groups and that kind of stuff. But we're not going to start with that. We're going to start with covariance structure only. And once we sort of get used to that, then we'll add in mean structure towards the end of the semester. But it sounds fancier than it really is. And like I said, I think I mentioned this at the very beginning, certain programs like Amos and EQS, and I'm pretty sure even Levon, which we're going to use in R and other places, start off assuming you want covariance structure. Right? You just want to hypothesize about the relationships of variables and not their levels. Where other programs like M+ assumes that you want mean structure and you have to tell it to turn it off. So this one assumes you don't want it and you have to turn it on. This one assumes you want it and you have to turn it off. So it's different programs have different assumptions about what it is you want starting off with. One of the biggest complaints I had in learning M+ was that there's all these built-in assumptions, things that they put in that they don't necessarily tell you. And then when you go to run a model, your degrees of freedom or other things won't match and you don't know why. And then you got to, dig deep into their manuals and things to figure out, oh, it's because it's doing the mean structure when I didn't tell it to do that. You have to turn it off and all of a sudden everything matches. So it's interesting. And again, diagram elements, if you have a single-headed arrow, this is basically representing prediction, right? The regression coefficients or factor loadings, either way, they're sort of treated similarly in these models. A double-headed arrow is a correlation, and any path that's missing, if the path doesn't exist, it's assumed to be zero. You're basically saying, I think this path doesn't exist, so the slope for that path is, I'm assuming, is zero. So if I have a couple of variables like this, let's see, like 3 or something, and maybe a couple of predictors. And let's say I think that this one predicts that one, and maybe that one. All right, this one predicts this one, and this one. So the fact that there isn't a variable or isn't a path going from here to here, like this path is not in there, that's the same thing as saying I'm gonna assume that this path is zero. By not including a path in a model, you're saying that prediction doesn't exist, or it's not significant, or it's close to zero. So sometimes not putting paths into a model is just as important as the ones you choose to put in, because you're actually making assumptions about what's going on with those those paths that don't exist in the model, just like you are the ones that do exist. So here's a path diagram that includes, this is really what's called a structural regression model. So what parts of this represent sort of the measurement components? So looking at this model, we talk about that models have, this kind of model can have two different parts to it. You can have a measurement component or components and regression or path components or structural components. So what parts represent the measurement and what parts represent structure? So the CESD right here, this one box. So treated this way, what does this tell you how it's scored? So it is measured continuously, but is it a latent variable or is it a measured variable? So if it's a measured variable, how is it being used in this model? And so everybody's getting one CESD score that's directly measured, right? So we're assuming the CESD in this case is not a latent variable. We're just using everyone's sort of score, like their single score you get from adding up all the items on the CESD. Everyone's getting just one single score that represents that level. You're also getting that for the BDI, which is the back depression inventory. I don't remember what the ZDRS is, but you're also just getting one score. So these are all sort of measured variables. So where's the measurement part of this actually represented? Squares are just the measured variables, but it's not the measurement component. So what does measurement do? Measurement is the part of the diagram that makes the latent variables, right? That creates latent variables, that actually connects latent variables to measured variables. That's the measurement part. So where's that? Yeah, so you think about everything that's purple, right? I guess it's sort of purple. Right? Everything that's purple is a measurement component for depression. So how does depression exist? Well, it exists because it is driving or being indicated by these three: BDI, CESD, and ZDRS. Right. So these three items are what's really creating or being driven by this depression latent variable, depression factor. So this is one measurement component. Is there another? So hold on to that arrow for a second. This is where some of these paths can actually get kind of confusing, because you have negative parental influence as a factor. So as a factor, a latent variable, it has to be indicated by something. It has to have measured indicators. So the measured indicators for this is everything in sort of green. So you have three measured indicators that are actually making up this negative parental influence, right? So we're thinking this thing exists, and it's being indicated by having a depressed parent, insecure attachment, and having some form of neglect in between a parent and a child. Okay, so here's where things get interesting. So here I have an arrow that's going from a latent variable to a measured variable, and we're saying this is a loading, this is measurement. But this arrow going from a latent variable to another latent variable, another one-headed arrow, this is not part of measurement, because this is structure. This is saying negative parental influence predicts depression. Even though there's no difference, there's no like pomp and circumstance around how this arrow is different than that arrow, except what it's connecting. Because this is going from a circle to a square is essentially a loading, a factor loading that's helping to sort of create this latent variable, where this arrow going from here to here is a regression path, part of the structure. And you can tell that because there is a disturbance up here, meaning that depression is being predicted by something to allow it to have an error or an error variance up here. All right, so that's what other parts on the model represent structure instead of measurement. So I have a prediction from negative parental influence to depression. That's structure. Where else is there structure? Now, because here's the things get weird. If I were to flip this arrow around, right, then I can argue that gender is another indicator of depression, and because the arrow is going from depression to gender. But because gender is going from gender to depression, that means that gender is predicting depression. It means I have some kind of hypothesis about there being a gender difference in depression. And depending on how it's scored, probably 0, 1, one gender being 0, one gender being 1, to look at a gender difference in the prediction of depression. So this also is structure. All right? Structure, structure. These all indicate this is measurement, 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 measurement. What about this one? The correlation between gender and neglect. Which, by the way, technically can't even happen, but that's a different story. We'll get back to that later on. It's easier to show it this way, that I think that gender and neglect are related in some way. But you technically can't even correlate these two things directly. So I have a correlation here. Is this measurement? Is it structure? What is it? Well, no. It's a good guess. So it's when I'm asking about it, being a little bit misleading, asking is it measurement or structure, is technically it's neither. It's not both. It's neither one. It's neither structure or measurement. Because anytime you put a correlation somewhere, it's considered an unstructured relationship. Right? So structure requires there to be a direction, some kind of prediction. So the fact I'm putting a correlation here means I don't know if gender is leading to neglect or whatever's going on. I just know that they're related, but I don't know why, and I'm not willing to put in a prediction in there. So I'm just going to capture that by putting in an unstructured relationship with a correlation. All right. So where do the E's come in? Is that sort of measurement? Is that structure? What is that? What are those E's supposed to represent? It is, but again, we use error in so many different ways. Let's be really specific. This E is an error created how? How is this error created? Like if I was to draw this out as a regression equation or something like that, I would say, what's the outcome? What's the Y in this? So again, let's go back to endogenous and exogenous and IVs and DVs. If something has an arrow pointing to it, what kind of variable is that? Right. So I'm going to start off with depressed parent. I'll say depressed parent is my outcome equals what? I don't have, we'll just say that, I don't know what this is. Again, if I'm trying to figure that this has to be something, I'm going to call it an A just because it'll be easier. Call this A1. If I wanted to put this out, I would say there's A1 times what? What's predicting depressed parent? Negative parental influence. So I'm taking something times negative parental influence, this times this, right, equals depressed parent plus my E, right, plus this thing, predicting it too. So this is relating a latent variable. Actually, I'll put a circle on it. This is relating a latent variable to a measured variable. So everything in this is part of a measure, is part of the measurement component. So if it's part of measurement, part of a factor analysis, this E then is the sort of unique variance. It's the part of negative parental influence. I'm sorry, it's the part of the depressed parent that isn't negative parental influence. Right? This is the specific and error variance wrapped in the one. It's everything that's unique about the depressed parent indicator. The difference is, all these E's, this E, all these E's, are all part of the measurement component. They're all unique variances as part of the measurement portion of the model. Let's look at this one. This path here, call this, I don't know, B1. This path is, again, the outcome is depression, right? Equals negative parental influence. That's being multiplied by that B1 plus what? Plus the D that's up here. So in this case, depression being the outcome, this is a slope predicting a latent variable, but it's not, this is not trying to create a latent variable. It's actually saying, I think this latent variable predicts this latent variable with some leftover variance. So in this case, even though it's called a disturbance, this is really an error in prediction. The prediction error, like a regression error. So even though this is called a D, it's called a disturbance, it's an error in prediction. This one's called an E, really is a unique variance. And that this D really is represented, if I really want to make this correct, I need to actually complete the whole thing. What else predicts depression? So it's really plus, we need another, like a B2 or something. B2 times gender, and plus that D. Okay. So this D really represents what's left over in depression, right? After you've predicted it with gender and negative parental influence. So this is just a prediction error, a regression error. For all of these other E's, these errors, these E's are really unique variances that are part of the measurement model, the measurement model, where these two slopes and the D up here are all part of the structure. They're all part of the regression. Okay? This seems really confusing and annoying now. Don't worry, we're going to see it over and over and over. It should become clearer as we go through. There are some times when things get a little tricky. Let's say that gender is a bad one, but let's say I had a variable like I don't know. I was thinking something else that's dichotomous, but maybe it didn't have to be. Let's say it's like grades. Okay, something like grades. That's a measured variable. We look at their GPA or something. If I take grades and I predict it with depression, all right, that's pretty straightforward. That's a prediction, right? I think that somehow, as grades go down, depression goes up or something like that. I think that grades has some kind of impact on a person's depression. However, let's say I have a hypothesis where I think that as kids become depressed, it affects their grades. So I set up a measurement model for depression using the Beck Depression Inventory, the CSD, the ZDRS, and I create this factor. And I think, okay, I now want to predict grades with depression. I want to go that direction. And this would have some kind of, an E, because I'm predicting a measured variable. This E, even though it looks just like the other E's, these E's are unique variances left over from the measurement. This is a prediction error left over from the prediction of grades by depression. But here's the whole point of setting this up. Why I want to point this out. Sometimes you got to be very, very careful and think through how you want to do things, because what happens here is that I've set up depression, right, as being indicated by BDI, CESD, and ZDRS. And I think this whole thing then predicts grades. Somebody else can say, well, no, grades just another indicator of depression. Because if you think about it, this arrow going to here to BDI with this E, that's an indicator of depression. How is that now different than this one? Mathematically, it isn't. It's actually going to be sort of estimated in the same way. So whether this is an indicator of depression or a variable the depression is predicting is all theoretical, because mathematically it doesn't make a difference. Okay, so you got to think through that stuff and be able to argue that this prediction really happens and that this should be a slope and not a loading, even though mathematically it'll be the same. Questions? There's a lot to throw at you on this one little slide. So what's the difference between measurement and structure? Sounds like a really good test question. The difference between measurement and structure. So the question was, measurement focuses more on prediction, and you got a 50-50 chance, and you blew it. It's the other way around. So measurement focuses on what then? If not prediction, then what? So influence and prediction are essentially the same thing. And those are all, if those things aren't measurement, then they're structure. It's this arrow here relating this latent variable to that latent variable. It's this one relating gender to this latent variable. Those are like regression predictions, whether it's prediction, influence, whatever you want to call it. This is all part that is structure or structural. What part is the measurement part? Well, that's the left side, but also the right side. Both. The purple and the green are both measurement, because they're both latent variables that are being indicated by these measured variables. So the measurement part is establishing the latent variables. So it's the part of the model that you need to establish latent variables is the measurement part. And anything that doesn't required or isn't the establishment of latent variables that are just relating things or predicting things is the structural part, like gender to depression, negative parental influence to depression. These three variables here are needed to make this latent variable exist, right? If they weren't here, this couldn't exist. So one part of a latent variable model is establishing those latent variables. That's the measurement part. We actually make negative parental influence exist by creating a measurement model that indicates that these three things are indicators of negative parental influence. That these three things are indicators of depression. But relating this latent variable to that latent variable isn't measurement. It isn't required to establish the latent variables. It's just prediction between the two of them, and that's the structure part. So anything that's like regression is structural. Anything that's like factor analysis is measurement. So from my perspective, being a measurement and psychometric student, for my PhD and whatever, it makes total sense to me, because measurement theory is about how do we establish our measured variables? How do we establish the things that we want to measure? Like, how do we actually do them? So there's like classical test theory where we combine things together and add up composites and use like Cronbach's alpha to establish measured variables, or to establish our scales or measures. Where latent variable models use factor analytic structures to create the scales, the things, the traits that we want to measure. So it makes sense. This is a measurement theory. I think that this thing can be measured by these three things. This is establishing a a scale or a latent variable, a trait measure by combining these three elements together into a latent variable. So to call that part measurement makes sense. And then as I relate these measured and latent variables to each other, that's measurement. But as I relate latent variables to each other, or measured variables to latent variables, or measured variables to each other, that's structure. So if you look at this, you would think, all right, loadings, these are like factor loadings, so that's measurement. This is like a regression slope, so that's like multiple regression, so that's structure. All right. By the way, if you think the measurement and structure components are tough, this next term is probably the one that bugs me the most because it seems to be the reverse of what it sounds like. We got recursive and non-recursive models. So recursive models, all direct paths are unidirectional and errors are uncorrelated. Non-recursive, any model with a feedback loop between endogenous variables or when error terms between related endogenous variables are correlated. Let me try to simplify this down a little bit. So in path models or even structural regression models, the direction of predictions should follow the same sort of path. If you're starting with like predictors on the left-hand side and you're going to go, to mediators and to outcomes, and you're sort of moving from left to right, you want to keep the arrows sort of moving in that same direction. Anytime, because sometimes models get big and you sort of lose track of things, you start to then have arrows that are coming back around to predict things. You're creating what's called a feedback loop. It's like saying, I think A predicts B, while B also predicts A at the same time. And while sometimes that can be done, most of the time it's not solvable. You can't have a variable predict another variable while it's also predicting the preceding variable. It's like creates this feedback loop. You can't establish the prediction because they're constantly trying to predict one another, and it just sort of keeps going around. It can't ever come to a final solution. So one of the things that, why this is sort of brought up recursive and non-recursive, is that you can't estimate parameters in a model if there are certain circumstances where it's like not possible to do so. So we start talking about model identification, like how do you actually make sure that a model can work? One of them is to make sure that your model is recursive. The problem is recursive sounds like it has a loop in it, like it's recurring, or it's like, it sounds like recursive sounds like the bad one, and non-recursive sounds like the good one, but in fact it's the other way around. Recursive good, non-recursive bad. You want models to be recursive, this means that all the parameters in the model can actually be estimated. So let's look at some examples. So let's think about these. So what kind of variables do we have in this model? We have which variables are exogenous? So y, x, and y. Yeah, y, x, and y. Kevin, that's good. Y, x, and y. Right. You can ignore this one because it's double-headed, right? So it's just saying these two things are correlated, which is in a regression model, that's what we'd assume anyway, that the predictors are correlated. We're going to try to control for that. And so we have all the single-headed arrows are going away from x, right? They're also going away from y, so that's fine. So that means that z and w are what? They're not exogenous, they're endogenous. Right, so they're both endogenous, even though z turns around and predicts w, because it's already been predicted, it's still endogenous, so is w, and then you have the errors at the end. All right, so this model is considered recursive, which is good. Why? Because the flow goes all in one direction, and even though it's there is this sort of additional prediction of z to w, everything's sort of going in one direction. Nothing seems to be looping back on itself. Like I don't have w also predicting y. I don't have other issues going on that may make this model, may make it so you can't estimate the parameters to it. So this one's called recursive. Again, it's going to sound backwards. Recursive, good. This model is recursive. Everything goes forward. This next one, if I just add in, they also want to predict Z from W. This model becomes non-recursive. It's non-recursive because you actually won't be able to estimate this model because you can't estimate the prediction of Z to W at the same time as predicting the prediction from W to Z. This is called a feedback loop, right? These two things are going to get stuck in a loop trying to predict one another because in order to predict this one, I have to establish how much this one predicts W, but I can't do that because at the same time I'm trying to figure out how much W predicts Z simultaneously. So it won't be able to estimate either one of these, and instead it's just going to continuously get stuck in a feedback loop and won't be able to define any parameters. So it would make sense. So why don't I just correlate them? Right? So I would say I don't know what the direction is. I think the Z predicts W at the same time as W predicts Z. The problem is only exogenous variables can be correlated. So I can put this correlation here between X and Y because they're both exogenous. Fine. But Z and W are both endogenous, so I can't just add a correlation here. The only thing I can do really is I can correlate their errors here at the end. And unfortunately, if I do that, this is also considered non-recursive. If you look, I have Z predicts W, and then I also am estimating this correlation between the errors. It actually you won't be able to estimate this model either. It's considered non-recursive. So you go back to the description. It says non-recursive, any model with a feedback loop between endogenous variables. All right, the feedback loop between endogenous variables. That's this. So we can't do that. That's why it makes it non-recursive. Or when error terms between related endogenous variables are correlated. The reason why you can't do this is because these two errors shouldn't correlate, because anything that would make Z and W related is already accounted for by the fact they're both being predicted by the same two preceding variables and that Z predicts W. So there should be nothing left to correlate here at all, because everything that's relating these two variables together should already be accounted for. If you add in this correlated error, you're basically causing an issue, another form of feedback loop in the model. You won't be able to estimate the parameters. It's like you're trying to estimate more variance and covariance than really exists in the model. It's going to make it so it's not, you can't estimate it. The parameters won't be able to be estimated from the analysis. Okay. This is, again, this will make sense later on when we get back to model identification, how to avoid non-recursive models. Just to get those ideas in your brain. Recursive is good, even though it looks like I would probably describe it. It seems to make more sense to describe this, not this one. Describe this as recursive. Like it seems like it's something that's actually sort of has like a sort of recurring something or other. So I always used to confuse recursive and non-recursive. I just think recursive is good. Non-recursive is bad. And there was a question, I think. It's a feedback loop in a different way. It's not. This is a direct feedback loop where you have a variable predicting itself. Predicting another variable that's also predicting it. It's a direct feedback loop. It functions in the same way because all the variability that relates Z to W should be accounted for in the model, right? Because not only are X and Y predicting both of those things, which should account for some of the relationship, any relationship that between Z and W that isn't accounted for by X and Y is accounted for by that prediction there. So there should be nothing relating their errors. They should be completely independent. So if we actually add in a correlation here to try to estimate that, again, it's like you're trying to estimate a variance that doesn't exist or a covariance that doesn't exist, and it will cause an issue trying to estimate the whole model altogether. Okay. We'll see later on as we go to try to specify models and talk about how to make sure that they are identified. These are all the terms we'll come back to in just a second. If you try to run a model that has something like, so by the way, this is a very simple model that has correlated errors. You can have correlated errors, and we'll see models with correlated errors later on. It's just you can't account for all the relation between Z and W like this, and then also have a correlation in there, or else you'll throw a sort of wrench in the works. You won't be able to estimate all the parameters. Remember what this is trying to do. It's trying to simultaneously solve for all of these predictions at the same time. So to do that, certain things have to be sort of given. Well, not given. Certain things have to already be sort of pre-estimated, like the variances of X and Y, because and this correlation can just be directly sort of computed, and the rest of the model then can be computed from that because these are already established. We can estimate these parameters. As soon as we start to add in stuff like these correlated errors, it starts to make it so there are things that cannot be estimated, and if one part of the model can't be estimated, then the rest of it then starts to fall apart as well. So again, it'll make more sense as we go into model specification and identification that will be coming up shortly. So some SEM questions. Does the model produce an estimated population correlation matrix that fits the sample data? Now, the reason I stated this way is to point out that the approach is a little bit different. So does the model produce an estimated population covariance matrix that fits the sample data? We're used to saying, does my sample fit my assumptions about the population? What we're actually doing is we have a sample, and now we're trying to figure out, okay, well, what population can I, if I were to hypothesize or theorize about the population that I think this sample comes from, what would that look like? And then does that actually explain my data? So when you actually draw these models, like even these models, we're actually trying to estimate what the variables look like in the population and estimate a population version of our matrix so we can compare it to our sample to see if it actually fits. Like, does my hypothesis about the population explain my actual data well? SEM calculates many indices of fit. There's different kinds, like close fit, absolute fit, and we're talking about a bunch of those. Chi-square, goodness of fit. There's something called there's the CFI and the GFI. The CFI is the comparative fit index. The GFI is the goodness of fit index. There's something called the root mean square error of approximation. There's a bunch, and there's the Tucker-Lewis index. There's the Kaike information criteria. There's a whole bunch of different things that tell you about how well your data fit, or how well your model fits your data, and we'll talk about those later on. But one of the things that these SEM type models allow for is model comparisons. So you can have different models based on different hypotheses. You can fit all the models to the data to see which one of those fits the data best, right? So which model best fits the data. And you can actually then argue that because it's the best fitting model, this is the one that's probably the most accurate, and actually have some evidence for why one model may be better than another. What's the percent of the variance in the variables explained by the factors? We can start looking at, well, all right, well, how much like communality? How much of these items are actually being explained by the factors? How reliable are the indicators at measuring the factor? What are the parameter estimates for from the model we can actually estimate and then be able to publish and put out there as being the the population estimates we got from our analysis? Are there any indirect effects? All right. So the indirect effect stuff, it becomes a little bit easier in these kinds of models. They usually will give you something called effect decomposition. You can decompose the effects into total, direct, and indirect effects between variables. Are there group differences? So this is probably, to me, one of the nicest things or the coolest things in terms of expanding your ability to do hypothesis testing, is this idea of multi-group models. So I can take any regression model that I want, and I can estimate it in different groups to see if the predictions differ across groups. So it now expands out your hypotheses, because instead of thinking about like sort of moderation in terms of means, we could think of terms of moderation in terms of prediction. So let's say I think that anxiety predicts depression. Right, that's a pretty common I mean, that's been shown a bunch that if you're of higher anxiety, you tend to also have higher depression. So this tends to predict this, right, with some error. Okay, so there's a little path model, right, where these are measured variables. And I'm saying I think anxiety predicts depression. Awesome. But I can do this and say, right, I think anxiety predicts depression, but the degree to which anxiety predicts depression is different for men as it is for women. So I can actually compute these models separately for men and women. And then let's say this is the slope 1 for men. This is slope 1 for women. I can actually compare the slopes between men and women to see if they're not equal. So I'm now saying I think the gender interacts with the slopes, with the prediction between anxiety and depression. I may have some that anxiety is stronger, the prediction between anxiety and depression is stronger for men than it is for women, or vice versa. I can also test to see if the variance is the variance of A for men is not equal to the variance of A for women, the variance of anxiety, both of these. I can also see if the error variance for men is different than the error variance for women's variance. I can compare all those things simultaneously, and none of that has anything to do with means. Right? Are they differing in variance? Are they differing in error? Are they differing in their prediction? And none of these are hypotheses about moderating effects on mean, but instead of on prediction. So it expands your ability to sort of test across groups and to test different kinds of hypotheses and how groups might differ. All right, so then another question here is, can change in the variance or mean be tracked over time? So we've done that before. We've done change in 485. We did it again in 524 because we looked at things like profile analysis and repeated measures designs. But we can actually expand that out and have what are called growth models. So growth curve, or oftentimes referred to as latent growth curve analysis, because you can look at, I have variables that I've taken at time 1, time 2, time 3, and time 4. All right, so across those times, I can then say, all right, I want to compute a latent intercept and latent slope. These are all going to be 1. And for the slope, this one's going to be 0. That one's going to be 1. That one's going to be 2. Going to be 3. And this would be then the linear slope. Don't worry about getting everything. We're going to come back to this. So it's called latent growth curve analysis because we're actually computing the intercepts and slopes for these variables across time as latent variables. But they have a very distinctive pattern of predictors that we're not going to estimate. Instead, we're going to actually state them directly so we can actually compute what the latent intercept would look like and what the latent slope would look like. And then I can even correlate these to see if there's a relationship between where they start and how fast they change. This is in a latent growth curve analysis. Make sense? To make it even scarier, so latent growth refers to these two things because they're both latent. I can replace these. This isn't stated in the slide, but just for fun. These instead could be latent variables at time 1, time 2, time 3, time 4, with their individual indicator, the individual items up here. All right. And if I do that, this becomes a latent variable, latent growth curve model. So I get latent twice. Latent variable, latent growth. Can a model be estimated with individual and group level components? Sure, you can actually do multi-level models. There are multi-level factor analyses, multi-level path models, multi-level anything. We can actually separate out between group and individual levels and do multi-level stuff with everything that we're talking about in here as well. We're not going to spend a lot of time talking about that stuff in here because we don't have time, but we can. Can latent categorical variables be estimated? Yes. So you can do something called like a mixture model or a latent mixture model. You can also, different kind of that is, can a latent group membership be estimated from continuous and discrete variables? So these two things do some similar stuff, mixture models and latent class analysis. This is the idea that I think people belong to certain groups. There are certain things they belong to, like there is let's say you're looking at indicators of heart disease. There is like the heart disease group, there's the at risk for heart disease group, and there's a low risk for heart disease group. But as people come in, you don't know which group they're in. So you look at their indicators and you're actually able to figure out I don't care about their trajectory. I don't care, like in growth models, I don't care about that kind of stuff. What I want to know is, can I look at the patterns of responses and figure out which of those groups they belong to? Can I classify people into, a high risk heart disease group based on the responses using latent class analysis? Because the classes, the groups, we don't know. As we're walking, we have no clue. So we're actually able to put people into latent groups. Now we're talking about, instead of just latent variables, we're now talking about groups being latent. Hidden groups people belong to, we can estimate through latent variable models. Can we predict the rate at which people will drop out of a study or end treatment? So you may have heard of survival analysis before, where time is a factor, like how long it takes for something to happen. There's also latent variable versions of that, discrete time survival mixture analysis. So the fact that survival and mixture means that are there different types of people, different groups of people that will drop out at different rates depending on what it is you're doing. So discrete time survival mixture analysis, you can combine these techniques together and do a multiple group, multi-level growth curve latent class analysis. I don't recommend it, but you can. It'd be a very complicated thing to try and do. I think, can you actually do that? Multi-level growth curve. All right, latent class analysis. It would really be a multi-group, multi-level growth mixture model. What really that would be. Whatever.